one waitress, one arrogant millionaire, and one grand piano. What started as a cruel attempt to humiliate her turned into a moment that silenced the entire restaurant and shattered egos in the quietest way possible, because you won't believe how she turned the tables, using nothing but raw talent and calm defiance. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. Deborah was the kind of person most people only noticed when they needed something: water, the check, an extra fork. At 25, she had mastered the art of moving like background music, present, efficient, invisible. She didn't mind. The restaurant wasn't her dream. It was her delay. What she really lived for sat in the far corner of the dining room, mostly ignored. A grand piano polished more for aesthetics than for sound. She wasn't flashy. She didn't tell customers she played. She didn't hand out stories with their dessert menus. But her fingers knew more languages than her voice ever had. She had learned to speak through melody, joy, grief, longing, all poured into keys with chipped edges and stubborn pedals. The world may not have been listening yet, but the piano always did. That's what kept her going, until the night someone decided her silence was permission. La Fontaine wasn't just expensive, it was expensive on purpose. The kind of place where a wine list is a flex and small talk sounds like a sales pitch. The air carried the scent of approval and reservation confirmations. Customers didn't eat there for the food. They dined to be seen, to feel above something. Deborah moved between tables like a ghost with excellent posture. No one asked about her past, her future, her anything, and that was fine. Because as long as she kept her head down, no one could knock her down. But even quiet people live loud lives inside. And Deborah's life, her real one, played out in measures and chords, stored quietly behind her ribs like a second heartbeat. No one knew. No one asked. Until he walked in. Leonard Grayson didn't enter rooms. He arrived in them. Like weather. He didn't just wear money. He wore the certainty that you knew it. White hair combed too carefully to be casual, a navy suit that practically sighed when he sat down, and a voice loud enough to disturb adjacent tables before the bread hit the table. Deborah knew his type before he said a word. He didn't need a reason to ruin someone's night. All he needed was a captive audience and someone who couldn't afford to talk back. The moment he read her name tag out loud. Deborah, huh? With that amused tilt of his head, she felt it in her gut. This wasn't going to be a shift she forgot. It started like a game, but the rules weren't spoken. They were implied. He made comments that couldn't be quoted but couldn't be ignored, praised her smile, mocked her posture, asked questions that weren't questions. "You look like someone with hidden talents," he said, tapping the rim of his glass. She nodded, smiled politely, moved on. But he wasn't done. Leonard never asked to be entertained. He expected it, and Deborah, as far as he was concerned, was just another amenity, something to fill the silence between sips of top-shelf scotch. She'd been through worse, sure, but the difference this time was the stage was public, and the trap wasn't about making her fail. It was about daring her to prove she could succeed, just so he could take the credit for her doing it. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that he wasn't the one writing the script anymore. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next part. She remembered her mother's hands before she remembered her own name. Hands that smelled like antiseptic and citrus soap. Hands that trembled from 12-hour nursing shifts but still managed to cook dinner, sign permission slips, and press down the sticky ivory keys of an old upright piano in the corner of their living room. The piano had been a gift from a retired neighbor who couldn't play anymore, but said it would be a shame to let it collect dust in a garage. It was chipped, uneven in tone, and beautiful in the way worn things always are. Deborah had been 6 when she first touched it with purpose. Not to bang the keys like a toy, but to press them, as if asking a question. Her mother showed her a few chords, and Deborah repeated them like prayers. Soon, she was playing melodies from the scratchy vinyl records they kept under the sofa. When her mother was too tired to read bedtime stories, Deborah played lullabies. When the power went out one humid July night, she played By Candlelight. Her first recital was at a modest church with a busted sound system and stained glass windows that filtered the sunlight like hope. She played Amazing Grace on a bench too tall for her feet to touch the floor, and when she finished, the room clapped like they were trying to wake the dead. That applause fed her in ways spaghetti and off-brand juice boxes never could. But hunger returns quickly when you're raised on thin margins. By the time Deborah turned 18, she'd auditioned for 3 conservatories and applied for 6 scholarships. None of them came through. Some letters were polite, some indifferent, but all of them said the same thing: not this time. Her mother had aged beyond her years, her health quietly fraying under the weight of constant sacrifice. Deborah picked up shifts at a local diner, then a gas station, then a catering company. The piano stayed. It always stayed. But instead of reaching toward it like a future, she passed it like a memory. She didn't quit. She folded the dream up like a linen napkin and set it aside, neat and careful. Because dreaming felt selfish when the lights needed to stay on and the rent couldn't wait. She still played, just softer, like whispering to someone who might forget she existed. The music never left her. It just waited its turn in silence. When she moved to Raleigh, it wasn't with a plan. Just a need for something different, something that didn't already have her name on it in lowercase letters. She scoured the job boards and circled La Fontaine, not because of the tips or prestige, but because she'd seen it once during a slow walk past downtown and noticed the piano in the corner. It was a real grand, polished to a shine that made the lights dance on its lid like secrets. She'd walked by slowly, her reflection bending in the glass. That piano looked like it belonged to a world she'd only visited in dreams. So when she got hired as a waitress, she told herself it was about money, but she knew better. During breaks, when the dining room emptied and the clink of glassware faded, she would slip over to the bench and play something soft, nothing flashy, just enough to feel her pulse again. She didn't play for the cooks or the busboys who sometimes paused to listen. She played for the girl who used to press cracked keys in a small apartment, hoping her mother's cough would fade if the melody was sweet enough. The restaurant staff never said much about it, but they noticed. And so did one other person, eventually. The one person she never wanted to hear her play. Leonard's voice could be heard before it was located. He laughed like punctuation, cutting off his own sentences with noise instead of meaning. From the moment he sat down, he owned the table and the space around it. His stories were loud, gilded in success, peppered with insults aimed at anyone who didn't dream as big as he had. He mocked college degrees, rolled his eyes at 9-to-5ers, and name-dropped mentors like he'd invented them. Deborah moved around his table with the same practiced ease she gave everyone else, but every time she returned, the air felt tighter. Leonard wasn't cruel with his tone. He was cruel with his ease, the way he dismissed people without raising his voice, the way he turned dinner into performance and people into props. He wore ambition like a weapon, sharp and swinging. Deborah wore hers differently. More like armor. It was sewn into the calluses of her fingertips, wrapped in the way she held her head down but never bowed it. Leonard looked at her like a puzzle. She looked at him like a storm. She was pouring wine when he made it impossible to ignore. "Tell me, Deborah," he said, his voice slicing through nearby conversations, "what does a girl like you dream about when she's not clearing plates?" The question wasn't curiosity. It was a spotlight he dragged into her lap. She kept her tone light. "I play piano sometimes," she said, not offering more. "A pianist?" he said, eyebrows lifting like it was the punchline he'd been waiting for. "How fascinating. Well, you must give us a performance then. Come on. What's a little music between friends?" She froze for a moment, then smiled, polite and firm. "I appreciate that, but I'm working tonight." He leaned back in his chair, took a sip of scotch, and let the silence fill with judgment. "Ah," he said. "All talk, no talent. That's disappointing." The smirk on his face was sharp enough to draw blood. Her hands didn't shake. Not yet. But something inside her stirred. Not anger. Not shame. Something older. Something fierce and familiar. She walked away without answering. But as she passed the reflection in the window, her mother's voice echoed inside her like a hymn. "You're not here to prove your worth. But don't you ever let someone shrink it, either." And Deborah knew right then this wasn't just dinner anymore. It was the start of something no one at that table would be able to laugh away. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Leonard sat smug in his chair, his entourage snickering under their breath like schoolboys who'd just pulled a fire alarm and waited to watch the flames. Around the room, forks paused mid-air. Wineglasses hovered inches from lips. Conversation thinned like mist under sun. Deborah didn't say a word, but somehow she was the center of it all. She didn't ask for the spotlight, but it had been shoved onto her with the force of a dare disguised as charm. Her co-workers froze, shoulders stiff, eyes darting between the piano and Leonard. No one moved, no one intervened. She had been here before, though not quite like this. Not with tablecloths this white or stairs this sharp. But she recognized the silence, not the kind that waits, the kind that expects. They didn't clap, but their silence said, "Go on." Deborah inhaled once, slow, intentional. Then she turned. Not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to signal a shift that no one could stop. Her hands didn't shake, but her stomach folded in on itself like a piece of paper crumpling inside her chest. She walked toward the piano, each step measured, not to create suspense, but to keep her knees from giving out. Her eyes never left the path in front of her, though she could feel Leonard's gaze pressing between her shoulder blades like a cold thumbprint. The piano wasn't just a destination. It was a battleground she didn't choose. She didn't walk to it to win. She walked to end the noise he created, the noise that wasn't just in the room but in her own ribs. That voice telling her to sit down, to smile, to stay small. Leonard had no idea what he'd done. He thought he'd forced a moment, but what he really did was open a door and shove her through it. Her fingers hovered above the keys before she even sat. A whisper of hesitation traced her spine, like a reminder that fear always arrives first, dressed like caution. She lowered herself to the bench, knees stiff, heart galloping. And then the voice came, not Leonard's, not the crowd's, hers, and not the polished customer service version, the old voice. The one that used to sing under her breath while practicing scales on broken keys. The one that heard her brother clap with crumpled paper plates at her first living room performance. The one that remembered her mother muttering, "You missed a flat there, baby, but I felt it anyway." That voice wasn't gone. It had just been waiting, curled up in a corner of her chest, watching the world make her smaller than she'd ever agreed to be. This wasn't new. It was just louder. The crowd might have come for a meal, but what they were about to receive, none of them had the appetite for. Deborah had no plan to dazzle. She was just here to breathe, through music, through herself, through everything they thought she was. The first note came out like a question, tentative, barely there. A few people chuckled. Too soon. She ignored it. The second note followed, then the third, as if coaxing the melody from the air around her. The laughter didn't return. Not yet. She kept going. Her hands moved with caution, then curiosity, then confidence. She chose a piece she knew so well she could play it with her eyes closed. But tonight, her eyes were wide open. She watched the keys as if reminding herself this was real, that she was real. The melody began to bloom, not with volume, but with weight. It wrapped around the tables, slipped between wine glasses, curled around the smirks and the silence. It was a story now. Her story. The summers of sacrifice. The quiet rejections. The jobs taken instead of auditions. The mornings where she played to no one because she needed to remember who she was. It all came out. Not in lyrics, not in words, but in sound, in shape, in something far more honest than any conversation Leonard had ever had. And then the room shifted, slowly at first, like someone tilting the entire atmosphere just a few degrees. Conversations stilled completely. The clinking of silverware ceased. Even Leonard's table, once animated with smug whispers, sat motionless. Deborah didn't look up, but she didn't need to. She could feel it. The room that had once watched her like a sideshow now sat in awe, like congregants at a service they didn't know they were attending. This was no longer about a waitress playing a tune. This was about something ancient, a soul reclaiming its space. And every person in that room, whether they understood music or not, could feel it in their chest. The respect they hadn't given her, she took back without permission. With each note, she wasn't just playing, she was unburying, unfolding, unapologetically existing. She didn't raise her voice, she raised the room. Deborah didn't play like someone trying to impress, she played like someone finally telling the truth. Her hands moved with a memory older than the room, older than her fear, older than the moment that forced her to sit there in the first place. The melody she pulled from the keys wasn't polished or rehearsed for a crowd. It was lived. Every phrase carried something unspoken. Every rise and fall of tempo matched the breath of someone who'd learned to survive disappointment without bitterness. The notes weren't just music, they were scars, unstitched into sound. Pain wrapped in rhythm, love dressed in silence. She wasn't asking to be seen, she was declaring that she'd always been there. Somewhere between the middle section and the final refrain, something inside her clicked, like a key finding the right lock after years of fumbling. Her shoulders loosened, her wrists floated, her fingers fell into perfect sync with the story she was telling. And then came the last note. Not a crescendo, not a crash, just a landing. Soft, final, certain. It didn't ring, it settled. And the second it did, the air in the restaurant changed again. Not with noise, but with reverence. Silence has levels. There's awkward silence, tense silence, silence that follows a mistake. But then there's this kind, the silence that follows something sacred. No one dared speak. The breath of the entire dining room seemed caught in suspension, as if everyone feared that even shifting in their chair might unravel the spell. And then it started. Not from Leonard's table, but from the back. A slow clap, one pair of hands, then another, then a wave of applause that filled the room like thunder in a valley. Her co-workers joined in, wide-eyed, smiling like they were seeing her for the first time. Diners stood, some with tears they didn't wipe away. They weren't clapping for entertainment. They were clapping because they had just witnessed something they couldn't explain, but couldn't ignore. Leonard was the last to join in. His hands came together with a mechanical rhythm, slow and careful, like he was trying to measure the right amount of praise to cover the embarrassment. It was the kind of clap you give when you know you've been outclassed, but can't admit it. "Well," he said, his voice louder than it needed to be, breaking the spell just enough to remind everyone of his presence, "that was unexpected." Deborah didn't flinch, didn't roll her eyes, didn't toss back a clever retort. She just looked at him, eyes steady, lips pressed in a line that said more than any comeback ever could. Her silence met his smirk like water meeting flame. Unbothered, unaffected, extinguishing it without effort. Still trying to regain control, Leonard leaned forward slightly, glass in hand, and said, "Clearly, you've got a gift." His tone held the remnants of arrogance, but it was hollow now, brittle at the edges. Deborah finally spoke, her voice calm, even, almost gentle. "Everyone has a gift," she said, holding his gaze. "It's how you use it that matters." Her words didn't rise. They didn't need to. They fell like a gavel in a courtroom, subtle but final, and the people around them heard it. You could feel it in the shift of posture, the tightening of shoulders, the slow nods of agreement from those who just moments ago had been sipping wine and minding their own business. No one spoke, but you could sense the message. The lesson had landed. The tables that once buzzed with idle chatter had gone quiet with reconsideration. Leonard's entourage, who earlier had laughed too loud and clapped too soon, now sat in stiff silence. One of them took a long sip of water. Another looked down at his phone, pretending to read a non-existent message. The dynamic had turned. Waiters who usually avoided eye contact with difficult guests now looked Deborah in the eye when they passed her. Diners who had barely noticed her before the piano now watched her with a different kind of attention. Not as a server, but as someone they couldn't quite categorize anymore. Leonard still had money, no doubt, still had influence. But tonight he didn't have the room, because tonight the room had chosen meaning over mockery. And in that unspoken choice, Deborah hadn't just changed the tone of the night. She'd rewritten the hierarchy. The air felt different now, not expensive, not exclusive, but honest. And for once, that was enough. The restaurant tried to return to normal, but something had shifted and wouldn't go back. Forks moved again, napkins were lifted, drinks refilled, but conversations stayed lower, slower, like the room had agreed to speak in whispers out of respect. Deborah slipped away from the piano without a word and returned to her station, but now every eye seemed to follow her, not out of curiosity, but out of awareness, like the diners had finally noticed a painting that had been hanging in the room all along. One older man, still holding his knife and fork above a half-eaten steak, leaned slightly as she passed and said softly, "You're not just a waitress." He didn't say it to flatter her. He said it like he'd just realized something about the world he wished he'd known sooner. And the words kept coming. A woman with silver curls and a velvet scarf touched Deborah's arm gently as she poured water. Her eyes were glassy with tears. "I used to play," she whispered, "long ago, but I never had the courage to play like that." Across the room, a young couple who hadn't stopped clapping earlier raised their glasses in her direction. "You gave us chills," the man said. "Thank you." Another patron left a napkin with a scribbled message folded next to the tip. "Don't let the world shrink you again." Every compliment landed like rain on dry soil. Deborah smiled each time, but not because she needed validation. It was the recognition, the kind that isn't loud, but honest, that healed something in her. Peace. And just when she thought the moment might quietly pass into memory, a couple who hadn't said a word all night approached her near the kitchen and handed her a folded bill. "That's for your next lesson," the woman said. "If you don't take it, we'll just leave it on the table anyway." Deborah tried to protest, but the couple was already gone, disappearing into the night with nothing but kindness left behind. Leonard, of course, stayed behind, just long enough to lose whatever control he thought he had. He asked for the check, and the server, who had once rushed to his table with the urgency of a man delivering royal commands, moved without the usual bounce. Leonard scribbled his signature with a pen that didn't seem to write fast enough. He didn't look up when Deborah approached to collect the folder, but he spoke, low and clipped. "You've made your point." Deborah paused, tilted her head slightly, then met his eyes with calm clarity. "I didn't need to," she said, voice steady. "I just needed to play." He blinked, caught somewhere between annoyance and defeat. There was no comeback left in him, and that silence spoke louder than his earlier spectacle ever had. He wasn't furious. He was irrelevant. And worse, he knew it. For a man who fed on power, that kind of irrelevance was a slow unraveling. But not everyone at his table was made from the same threads. As she turned to leave, one of the younger men seated beside Leonard stood and cleared his throat. He looked nervous, not unsure of her, but unsure of himself. "You were amazing," he said, quiet but firm. "Truly." Deborah blinked, surprised not by the praise, but by the sincerity in his eyes. It was the first real thing she'd heard from that side of the table all evening. She gave a small nod, touched more than she let show. For a second, she saw something human behind the tailored jacket and polished grin, and in that moment she remembered something important. Not all wealth was arrogance. Not every expensive seat came with cheap intentions. Some people just hadn't seen what they were looking for until someone like her played it into the air. The shift didn't end the night. It redefined it. Deborah kept working. Plates still needed clearing, wine still needed pouring. She was still in uniform, still clocked in, still handling orders with quiet grace. But now, the air around her moved differently. People didn't just glance at her. They saw her. Co-workers passed her with nods that meant more than words. Diners waited to catch her eye, not to call her over, but to offer some small acknowledgement. A smile, a thumbs up, a simple thank you. And none of it changed her job, but all of it changed the room. The arrogance had drained out. What lingered now was humility, admiration, a kind of collective stillness that stretched between strangers. And Deborah, without asking, without fighting, had become something rare in a room like that. Unforgettable. She didn't change jobs, she changed the weather inside the room. She walked home that night with her coat barely buttoned, the cold slipping through fabric like a quiet dare. But she didn't mind. The air felt cleaner than it had in months, like the city had exhaled along with her. Her shoes tapped the pavement in a steady rhythm, and for once, her thoughts weren't crowded with survival math. No rent panic, no grocery stretching, no budgeting fatigue. Just this one odd realization blooming in her chest. The tips from that night, more than just kindness, more than gratitude, were enough. Enough for the rent. Enough for the overdue electric bill. Enough for the piano lessons she'd been putting off month after month, convincing herself they were luxury when really they were breath. Her mind didn't return to Leonard. Not even once. He had been loud, but forgettable. What stayed with her was the applause. Not the sound of it, but the intent. Not celebration, but recognition. The walk was long and the streetlights flickered now and then, but her steps didn't falter. She wasn't heading home to crash from exhaustion. She was walking home to play. The apartment was modest, just 3 rooms stitched together with thrift store furniture and warmth. The moment she stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floor welcomed her like an old friend. In the corner, her upright piano waited, scuffed off-key in spots and loyal. She ran her fingers across the lid as if greeting a sleeping pet, then sat down without turning on another light. The street lamp outside did the job well enough. She didn't warm up, didn't think, she just played, not to prove, not to perform, just to feel the music rise through her fingers and out into the silence. The keys weren't smooth, but they obeyed her. The notes weren't flawless, but they were hers. And in the middle of her second song, a car alarm went off down the street, startling her hands off the keys for a moment. But even that couldn't break the rhythm inside her. She laughed quietly, adjusted her shoulders and picked up where she left off. The sound that filled the room wasn't polished or poised. It was something better. It was honest. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't trying to catch up with who she used to be. She was sitting with the woman she'd become. Tired, yes, but grounded. By Monday, the whispers had started. One of the regulars who'd dined that night told his niece, who posted on her blog, which was seen by someone else who had connections. A local food critic tweeted something vague about the most unexpected live performance I've seen in a fine dining setting, and the restaurant's voicemail filled with messages asking what night the pianist played. But the real moment came a few days later when Deborah answered a call from a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was calm, clipped, and oddly kind. A music producer from Nashville had been in town, dining quietly at a corner table that night. He hadn't said a word afterward. But he'd heard. He remembered. And now, he wanted her to come in, not for a label deal, not for fame, not for anything hollow. Just a demo, a door. She didn't ask how he got her number. She didn't question if it was real. She just paused, let herself feel the disbelief, and then said yes. Not because she believed it would change her life overnight, but because it could change her next step. And that, for once, was enough. She didn't go into the studio with expectations. She went in with gratitude. For the invitation, for the silence, for the clarity. She wasn't chasing stardom. She wasn't thinking about stages or viral moments or booking agents. What she was thinking about was that little girl in a South Carolina living room playing Amazing Grace for her mother's tired smile. She was thinking about the pauses she took over the years and how each one wasn't an end, just a comma. Life hadn't stolen her voice. It had simply handed her different measures to rest in, and now the melody was returning, familiar, faithful. Sometimes the miracle isn't the spotlight, or the headline, or the applause. Sometimes the miracle is the quiet return to yourself. If you've listened this far, maybe it's because something in Deborah's story echoed something in yours. Maybe you've hidden a gift so long it started to feel like it never existed. Maybe you've let people shrink you, define you, talk over you while you carried a song they'll never understand. Maybe you've been waiting for someone to call your name with sincerity instead of expectation. If so, listen. You don't need a spotlight to be powerful. You don't need permission to matter. All you need is one quiet, defiant decision to play. Play anyway. Say it out loud. Show up. Because the world is full of Leonards. Loud, sharp, and desperate to feel taller by cutting someone else down. But it only takes one Deborah to remind them that real power doesn't announce itself. Real power sits down at a piano, breathes deep, and plays until the noise stops. And when the last note lands, the silence that follows will never forget you. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from. And if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts.